Okay, we have participants loading in, so we will start in a couple minutes. All right, I think we are going to start. People are still loading in, but I want to be respectful of people's time. So I think we will start. Finn, can we put the panel on? Great. Well, welcome to this. I wanted to welcome everybody to this morning's program, which is jointly hosted by American Leadership Initiative and the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Both ALI and CSIS have done work in the climate space, and I'm really excited about our collaboration on this program. We have really an amazing panel lined up for this conversation, which is, I think, especially timely given three significant announcements over the past month. The first is the conclusion of the COP26 talks, which, while didn't go as far as many would have liked, still had resulted in significant accomplishments. The second is the US-EU agreement on steel and aluminum trade. And the third is the joint announcement by the US and China to cooperate on reducing methane emissions. So although these are really great steps forward, many challenges remain. In July, the EU announced an ambitious carbon border adjustment program or mechanism, or CBAM, which has really raised the question in the US of how to respond. And there's now, I think, a vigorous debate in Washington regarding should the US set a price for carbon? What should that be? And should the US have a CBAM? And obviously there are challenging politics surrounding these questions with, opponents from carbon intensive industries and states, and then supporters embracing it both as a needed step to reduce carbon, but also as a potential competitive advantage for the US over countries with more carbon intensive manufacturing. There are also obviously questions about whether a CBAM, how it would be regarded by the WTO. And of course, we have looming the role of China. So we have an incredible panel with us today to help shine some light on these issues, starting with our good friend, Congressman Earl Blumenauer, chair of the House Ways and Means Trade Subcommittee. Representative Blumenauer was elected 25 years ago and has served on the Ways and Means Trade Subcommittee since 2007. He's a strong environmental advocate and known to many as an avid bike rider. Many of us have his little bike lapel pins. Fresh from Glasgow, we're fortunate to be joined by David Livingston, Senior Advisor to the Office of the Presidential Climate Envoy, John Kerry. Mr. Livingston has an extensive background in both climate and trade, having worked in consulting, Council on Foreign Relations, as well as the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative, the WTO, and the UN. Catrina Rorke has worked on climate and environmental issues for over 15 years, starting on Capitol Hill, then working in a variety of think tanks and nonprofit organizations before landing in her current spot as the Vice President of the Climate Leadership Council. She's the author of a number of papers discussing both the technical and policy aspects of CBAMs. And last but certainly not least, we have Bill Reinsch, who is the Scholl Chair for International Business at CSIS and is a leading thought leader on trade. His background is very extensive, having served as the Undersecretary of Commerce for Export Administration, the President of the National and the President of the National Foreign Trade Council, all after spending 20 years on Capitol Hill. With that, I'm going to turn the program over to our panel. Each panelist will give brief remarks, after which I will facilitate a discussion among the panelists. And I'm asking the audience to put your questions in the Zoom Q&A function, and we will try to get to as many of them as possible. Congressman Blumenauer.
Thank you, Owen. I've been looking forward to the conversation. I agree with your assessment that there have been some encouraging signs of late. Having returned from Glasgow myself, I was encouraged with the spirit, the energy. There is a growing, I think, consensus about the nature of the climate crisis. And I will tell you, having represented Portland, Oregon, in the most horrific series of events, including the heat dome that killed people. We've seen the floods. We've seen horrific forest fires. I think people in the United States and around the world understand that we simply have run out of time. And I think there is a new sense of urgency. There's a modest hope for optimism, but let's be real. We have to deal with the challenge that China presents. I feel as I've had an opportunity over the last 25 years to interact with some of the Chinese. There were areas where there was some encouragement. A decade or so ago, I thought that there was a little more hope. I was one of those people 25 years ago that voted to let him in the WTO, 20 years ago rather, and have been bitterly disappointed that subsequent administrations have been unable to deal meaningfully with making the Chinese live up to their obligations. I feel like it's Lucy in the football. You remember that poor Charlie Brown ended up flat on his back because she always moved the football. And I feel that's the situation with the Chinese. We're involved in a World Cup soccer game that deals with the fate of the planet. And while we're playing soccer, the Chinese move from soccer to rugby to cage fighting. They do what is in their best interest. And I see no indication that they're going to adhere to agreements in a way, provide the transparency. I mean, look what's happening with their investment in coal. Unprecedented. There's 250 million gigawatts of production that is in the pipeline. And this last year, the coal-fired fleet increased 30 gigawatts, while the world retired 17 gigawatts of coal production. I do think the carbon border adjustment is a different way of approaching this. I'm encouraged by what we've heard from our friends in the European Union and conversations we've had with various parliamentarians and trade ministers. This is an opportunity for us to harness the opportunity to strengthen the American economy, to be able to make real progress, and to do something that the Chinese cannot ignore in terms of access to our markets. The Trump administration was a textbook example of how not to deal with the Chinese. Going it alone, making odd one-off deals, scattershot tariffs, and not harnessing our friends and allies and people who share our interest. A carbon border adjustment, I think, is a tactic that can help us reverse that. And it's one that I'm very interested in exploring further this year on Capitol Hill, working with an administration that is committed under the leadership of Secretary Kerry. I'm optimistic that we can move this across the finish line and harness these various elements together. I look forward to the conversation and learning more from your distinguished panel and your guests out on the Zoom call.
Wonderful, thank you. David?
Well, thank you very much, Ori. Thank you to the American Leadership Initiative. And thank you, Congressman Blumenauer, for your leadership and your, not just in terms of action, but also in terms of conceptually laying out the framing and the framework for the issues that we're grappling with, and for this interesting nexus of climate and trade, which I think not just the United States, but many of our other like-minded partners around the world are starting to think through the tools and the approaches that might be most suitable to grapple with that nexus over the years to come. I want to just do a quick debrief on sort of what happened at COP26, some of the more notable takeaways, and some of the interesting pieces that we have floating out there that hopefully we'll be able to build more connective tissue between over the months to come. COP26 was, I think, for those that understood what was possible, not just what was asked, but what was possible, a measured success. We reached a Glasgow declaration that that was strong, that called, for example, for the first time for the phasing out of fossil fuels subsidies, for the phase down of coal, et cetera. These are insufficient, but still significant and necessary steps in terms of what happens at the multilateral level, where 200 countries around the world are haggling over every comma and every inch. But at the same time, the thing that most excites me is that more so than any COP in history, in my opinion, we had proactive initiatives of various different sort of coalitions of the willing that put in place cooperation, and importantly, market signals and platforms for further cooperation and policy construction that are going to stay and be durable regardless of who sits in the White House, regardless of who has which chamber of Congress down the street. And so let me just mention a couple of these things. We had a global forestry announcement with countries joining together to announce an end to deforestation by 2030 and working to mobilize nearly $20 billion of both public and private money to help deliver on that. We had a global methane pledge that included 100 countries around, more than 100 countries around the world, representing 70% of global GDP and nearly 50% of global anthropogenic methane emissions, committed to seeking a dramatic reduction in global methane emissions over the coming decade. Now, that doesn't mean anything if we don't address CO2, but that's an enormous down payment on the sort of progress we're going to need in this decade if we have the ability to reach net zero emissions by 2050 and to keep 1.5 degrees C within reach. But then when it comes to markets and innovation, we also realize we can't do this alone just with statements of intent. We need to give countries and give companies and give citizens new tools to be able to deliver on those. That's where innovation is so important. So we had, for example, the Agriculture Innovation Mission on Climate, launched by the United States and the United Arab Emirates with the support of the EU, the UK's COP26 presidency and beyond, with over 30 different countries joining as members, 80 different non-government partners joining as well. And what we announced at COP26 was what we call an early harvest commitment among these partners to mobilize more than $4 billion in new spending over the next 5 years towards climate smart agriculture innovation. That means that if we're successful at the end of that 5-year period of aim for climate, as we call it, the Agriculture Innovation Mission for Climate, we'll be driving new public capital and new public-private partnerships into things like agri-photovoltaics, integrated solar that can sit over cropland, that can not only generate electricity and help those agricultural operations go off grid, but can also help to do smart shading with the panels, using AI, machine learning to be able to increase agricultural harvest as we integrate renewable energy into our agricultural systems. Low carbon fertilizers, but also adaptation technologies. Let's say drought-resistant crops, new material science that allows us to wrap around fruits and vegetables and perishables and increase their life so that we're reducing agricultural waste. There are many more innovations we can work on there. And then finally, I'll just note something called the First Movers Coalition that President Biden announced at COP26, working closely with Secretary Kerry, our team, and the World Economic Forum. This is all about taking demand signals that we know are going to be there in 2030 and bringing them forward to today. So it gets some of the biggest companies in the world. In fact, we have a set of companies in the First Movers Coalition just so far that represent around $7 trillion in market cap. Amazon, Apple, DHL, Trafigura, some of the largest companies in the world and the most relevant to global value chains, shipping companies, right? Consumer goods companies, companies with value chains that span national borders and indeed span sectors. We're getting those companies to commit to a certain percentage of their consumption of certain products, so their steel purchases, their shipping demand, et cetera, to be completely decarbonized by 2030. So 10% of our steel purchases will be green steel. 10% of our cement purchases will be zero carbon cement. We've worked hard to define what that looks like. We have rigorous definitions and rigorous standards. And then we get those companies to send those signals out there. That demand signal with credible, credit-worthy counterparties then allows suppliers to go and actually invest in the green steel factory, not in 2028, but today, knowing that the demand is going to be there. It allows the cement factory to go, invest in a new process that will reduce its need for clinker, knowing that demand will be there tomorrow. And finally, it'll allow us to lower the cost of capital for those green suppliers, those new upstarts in the market, and those new technologies in the market. Now, this works hand in hand, just finally to mention, with some policy developments as well. We have sort of voluntary coalitions, we're bringing together public and private, but we're also doing this in a way that should hopefully be very complementary to the global policy evolution. So I was with Secretary Kerry at the G20 in Rome. On the sidelines of the G20, President von der Leyen of the EU, President Biden announced a détente, a ceasefire in the steel and aluminum 232 tariffs that we inherited from the European Union, from the Trump administration. And it's an example of how we can work with the European Union to not look backwards, but look forwards and to transform what had been a source of friction in our relationship into something that we can work on together. Now, what are we going to work on together? They announced that not only were they achieving a sort of an arrangement, a ceasefire in the steel 232 tariffs, but that we're going to work together, US and EU, like-minded partners, on addressing global steel overcapacity in a way that integrates climate concerns. This is really important. We have a steel overcapacity problem. That's not new. We know it's been around for many years, but no countries have ever had the leadership to step up and say, let's think outside the box, let's think creatively and work over the coming year to do that in a way which makes policy decisions on the basis of carbon intensity, sends the right signals and incentives to the market to deliver cleaner steel. And we're going to do that in a way which is going to be good for American workers as well, and good for our European partners. And we're also not going to keep others out. It's going to be inclusive. So we're going to welcome other like-minded countries in as long as they're willing to work towards the same goals. So these are the sorts of things that I think will start to work in concert, as you see. I mention all these not to just throw out a random smattering of things we've been working on, but to show some of the logic between them. When you have a green steel producer that's seeing demand from their private sector counterparty, and at the same time, they're also seeing the policy signal as well from the US government, the EU government, they know the direction of travel. There's still a lot more to be done. There's still a lot more sort of ideas to be honed and refined. That's why I'm so glad to be joining a smart group this morning to be talking about this. But I want you to know that we're working on our side in the Biden-Harris administration on putting in place some of those pieces, creating the platform upon which others can dance and create the sort of change that we need over the coming decade. And thanks for letting me join today and be part of this discussion.
Thank you, David. And I know that you have to leave early to attend to pressing business. So thank you for sharing that. I'm going to turn to Catrina, who's going to talk to us a little bit about carbon border adjustment mechanisms in specific.
Thanks, Ree, and thank you for hosting this conversation. It's a really terrific opportunity that we're seeing in climate change to unite the conversation about climate ambition and trade ambition. We're unlocking a whole lot of potential here. We're shifting the conversation in a way that enables higher ambition pathways. It's really terrific to be part of this conversation. So thank you to you and the other panelists. Let's talk about what that opportunity is. As countries are increasing the ambition of their climate programs, increasing the prices in market mechanisms that they use to drive down carbon emissions. They're running up against a perennial problem in developing climate policy, which is a substantive concern that a high ambition policy domestically will force emissions overseas, force jobs overseas, create carbon leakage. It's a hesitation that has beleaguered US climate conversations and climate conversations in our partner countries. And we're always looking for solutions. To date, the solutions have been, well, let's pull back on costs for climate ambition for a few key sectors. But now we're seeing the tables turn a little bit, and I want to talk to you about why. We're starting to understand better this concept of a carbon advantage. If you unlock a carbon advantage by charging imports for their emissions, you can create a new economic opportunity for your domestic economy if you are ambitious. So let's talk about what that means. At the Climate Leadership Council, I work with a lot of Fortune 100 companies, multinationals that are working on cleaning up their supply chains. And we were pulling in anecdotal data that the US makes everything with fewer emissions more efficiently than our international partners. We have no model to study that. So at the council, we built the first model of its kind to study the carbon emissions across countries, across economic sectors, follow the supply chain, and see what the relative carbon intensity of manufacturing is across the global economy. And the news for the US is absolutely terrific. We are among the most carbon efficient manufacturers in the world. In fact, it takes 80% more carbon emissions to create the same dollar value anywhere else in the world than it does in the United States. China, India, Russia, emissions from their economic activities are 3 to 4 times higher than those same activities in the United States. So this is an unrealized advantage that the US has already because we are driving down emissions across our economy. And I do mean across our economy. The advantage is persistent. From minerals to microchips to motor vehicles, the US makes things better than our partners. And this is true for our partner countries too. The European Union has a carbon advantage over many of its competitors, Canada also. And now we're seeing these threads come together. So the European Union announced a CBAM in July. We know that the UK government is considering it. Canada is pretty far along. We've heard the White House talk about it. David referenced the steel and aluminum deal between the US and the European Union. Our partners in Japan are moving forward. So put these countries together, 53% of the global economy is actively considering proposals that will unite climate and trade, charge imports for the emissions associated with their manufacture. We're creating this new leverage point that allows high ambition countries to claim the higher ground competitively because they are ambitious. For example, we've studied what the impact of a border adjustment would be on the steel industry in the United States. It's an industry for which we have a whole lot of data, so it made it easy to study. At the council, we propose a carbon fee of $40 a ton. So we just applied that carbon fee to steel manufactured in the United States and manufactured overseas. The US is the cleanest supplier of steel to the US market. A ton of steel sold in the United States is cleanest if it is manufactured here. We are 2 to 4 times cleaner than our international partners. So every ton of steel that comes in is higher carbon than what we could make here. So when we introduce the border adjustment in the steel industry, what we find is that we cut imports in half. We increase steel sales of US made steel product as much as we have capacity for, on the order of 10%. And we increase profitability in the steel industry on the order of 35 to 40%. So we're using a climate policy to increase the competitive position even of a carbon intensive industry. This is what we can unlock if we unite climate and trade, and that's why we're moving in this direction. Thank you so much.
Yeah, that's really exciting news. So thank you, Catrina. Bill, you want to give us your thoughts from the trade perspective? You're muted. You're muted.
Sorry about that. Happens to me frequently. Thank you, Arita. It's a pleasure to be with you all. I think I just want to make 3 quick points. First, what CSIS has been doing in my little shop has been to try to bring environmental experts and trade experts together to communicate. We've learned they don't speak the same language, and they still don't speak the same language, but we're working on it, and I think we're making some progress. And I want to comment on a couple issues that we've discovered in the process of translation. One is there seem to be some people who believe there's kind of a fatal incompatibility between WTO rules and border adjustment measures on climate. And I just assert, I think that's simply wrong. Other people, Jennifer Hillman in particular, the Council on Foreign Relations, has written a very thoughtful paper on this subject. And the short answer is that, sure, border adjustment measures can be incompatible with WTO rules, but they can also be entirely consistent. It depends on the design and the construction. So if you go about it with care, you can make a border adjustment an element of your climate policy in a way that is consistent with WTO rules. And how to do that is, as I said, is something that we need to work on. It's not, doesn't happen automatically, but simply to dismiss the trade piece of this as an obstacle rather than a facilitator is wrong. The second point is on CBAMs. Having looked at that, and we have a paper coming out on this. We had a paper that came out in June on it, and we're going to have another one coming out shortly on the same subject, looking primarily at the EU and China and the United States. We see 3 scenarios, and it's hard to predict at this point which one is more likely. Catrina talked about the happy one, but there are others that are less happy. The first one is sort of a death spiral in which various countries pursue border adjustment measures, beginning with the EU, which is farther along than the rest of us. And the whole thing sort of devolves into a mutual recrimination, accusations of protection. We sue them, they sue us, and the process of transition to decarbonization slows down in a wave of litigation and negative diplomacy. The second one is the opposite, kind of a virtuous circle, which is what Catrina really was talking about, which is that countries are inspired by the actions of others and respond in kind. That's not always purity of motive. I mean, I can see a scenario in which the EU continues down the road they've begun on, which I think is very likely, although their end product is likely to be different than their initial proposal. It almost always is. And I can see American companies come in and saying, wait a minute, that's not going to help us. We need to get even, which is not exactly a pure motive. But the consequence of that, I think, will be to change the politics here, which lags behind Europe in terms of public opinion and thinking about this issue, and will make people, I think, more open to the idea that we need to essentially do something similar to what they're doing. And then hopefully you get a cascade effect, and the result is, as I said, a virtuous circle. Doing that is going to require something that we haven't talked about much so far, and that is having a common agreement on how to measure carbon content, which is kind of a technical issue as much, if not more, than a political issue. If we measure the carbon content of steel one way and the Europeans do it a different way and the Chinese do it a third way, you're asking for the first scenario I described, which is a bitter debate over whether countries are using this for protectionist purposes and not for climate mitigation purposes. If we could get together and probably via the OECD, which we think is the best organization to use for that purpose, and try to find at least a common way of counting, then countries could pursue their own policies based on a common denominator. The third scenario is essentially the big yawn as far as the Americans are concerned, which is that the Europeans do what they're going to do, and we figure out that it's probably not going to have that big an impact on us. And the studies that have been done so far, based on the EU proposal, not the final version, obviously, suggest that it's not going to have a big impact on us. And public opinion doesn't change here. and we just simply continue to fumble around looking for a policy. I hope that Catrina and David are right, and that we're moving in a more positive direction on that. But I think it's fair to say that if you look at other areas, digital trade being one, which is one we follow rather closely, the United States has had a lot of difficulty developing national policies. We don't have a privacy policy. We don't have a competition policy. We don't have a digital services policy. The Europeans have discovered the first mover advantage in regulation, and what they're doing is becoming the default. They may become the default on climate too, unless we get organized. And I'm encouraged by what Catrina and David have had to say, but I have to say there is a third scenario here, which is we fail to do that, and we continue to stumble around and let other people lead the way. The final comment is I just respond to something that Congressman Blumenauer said. I agree with a lot of the things he said about China. I would say that with respect to climate in particular, and I'll probably almost exclusively, I'm a bit more optimistic than he is. In dealing with the Chinese, I've never dealt with people that have a clearer view of what's good for them and focus on it so relentlessly. But it happens that climate decarbonization and climate policy is good for them. It's a political issue in China. It's an authoritarian state. The public opinion makes a difference. Their climate policies have caused a lot of problems, which are obvious if you've been there. They have their own imperative to do something on this. Getting them to cooperate overtly with us, which David could talk about, is a heavy lift for a lot of reasons that have nothing to do with climate. But I think at the end of the day, they share objectives with us on decarbonization, climate mitigation. And I think that creates a platform ultimately, maybe not working with them directly right now, but at least moving in parallel in the same direction. With that, I'll stop. Thank you, Ari.
Thank you, everybody. I'm going to ask David a question before he has to duck out. And that is, the Biden administration has, moved forward ambitiously, with issuing a whole series of reports, including, I think in October, there was the first ever National Intelligence Estimate report. There have been on climate. There have been reports out of Homeland Security, NSC, Treasury. Can you talk about the significance of these reports, key takeaways, and what other parts of Biden's executive order are still in process and how things are evolving?
Absolutely. So as you noted, Orit, a lot flows from the executive order that the president signed early on in office on addressing the climate crisis at home and abroad. That set forward a series of different policy initiatives and interagency discussions that include everything from reviewing our stance as the U.S. government using scarce taxpayer dollars in terms of our international energy posture. How and where do we spend scarce taxpayer dollars, and are we spending that in a way that just exacerbates already commercially viable fossil fuels that have received government support in past years, I think somewhat unflinchingly and unreflectively? Or are we applying very judicious and thoughtful scrutiny to where taxpayer dollars will do the most to accelerate the energy transition, while still being mindful, of course, of our compelling geostrategic interests, our energy security concerns, and attending to the energy access needs and energy development needs of the poorest? And I think that after a lot of discussion, that conversation's in a very good place. It reflects really, really nuanced and extensive and at times, very lively kind of debate and discussion. And I think the result of that is that you're going to get a policy which which moves the ball significantly without being blind to the multivariate different policy concerns that our international energy posture has to take into account. In other words, we're trying to be, to the degree possible, a measure twice, cut once sort of administration instead of the flip way around. Now, in addition to that, you noted some of the national intelligence, reports and estimates which have come out, the focus that's been put on climate change. I don't need to tell the audience here. I think everyone is intelligent enough to know, and those especially who are working in business and managing global supply chains understand that this is not actually a climate crisis that when it continues to manifest itself and exacerbate in the years ahead, where you can just sort of say, well, find me a country that's relatively resilient to climate change, and I'm just going to go move my operations there. We're talking about global supply chains. We're talking about disruptions that when there's a migration crisis or sea level rise takes out a port somewhere in South Asia, that disrupts entire global supply chains and has knock-on effects. Just look at what happened with the Suez crisis, with the ship stuck in the canal. Look at what's happening in our ports here from the COVID restart. These are just previews of what is to come if we do not address climate change sufficiently. And I think it's wrong to think about it as just a problem that will hit the poorest hardest, that then the developed world needs to be aware of and care about from a moral perspective. That's absolutely true. But even setting that aside, you also have to think about this in terms of the health of the global economy, in terms of the health of the global supply chains on which we rely. Now, there's one other piece, though, that I want to point to that I think was lost sometimes in the reporting on how the intelligence community and the US government is assessing the threat of climate change and the opportunities that climate change presents over the decades ahead. And for the first time, there's really a focus on clean tech competition to control and to be a major player in the commanding heights of the 21st century economy. There's the recognition that alternative energy is now the energy sector. There's no such thing as alternative energy anymore when the vast plurality of new investments going into the power sector are in wind, solar, batteries, nuclear, advanced energy sources. When those that control the software that will harmonize the grid and make sure that the various different renewable resources we have on the grid are working as a symphony rather than a cacophony, that too is going to be an important aspect of controlling this sort of important commanding heights of the 21st century economy. And countries are not going to willingly just stand by and buy other countries' products to do that. There will be a race to ensure that much of that is manufactured at home, at least that countries are well integrated in an advantageous way into global supply chains. And so we as the United States government need to make sure that we're leaning into that opportunity. Our office, Special Presidential Envoy for Climate, has been working very closely with others at Secretary Raimondo at the Department of Commerce, Secretary Granholm at the Department of Energy, and others on building out a clean tech competitiveness strategy and a clean tech export strategy for the United States government that goes beyond just saying, well, we've got to manufacture solar panels again, we've got to manufacture wind again, looking up and just saying, oh, what clean energy sources can you point to? We need to be rigorous. We need to be bottom up. We need to think about everything from the sorbents and the solvents that will be useful for carbon capture and CCS around the world, thinking about where do we have a comparative advantage as the United States, to the software and the services that are powering clean energy transitions in the US and around the world, to, of course, large-scale manufacturing of infrastructure like offshore wind turbines, et cetera. So this is going to be an effort which is going to take time to do right, but we've got to start it today so that we have a gift to give, not just to this administration later on, but to future administrations, to kind of giving them a roadmap of US competitiveness in clean tech, in clean technologies and clean energy. So because as much as we do here at home, we have to be honest, the largest markets are going to be in emerging economies around the world, where energy demand growth is the fastest and where emissions growth is the fastest. Those are multi-trillion-dollar market opportunities in some of these clean technologies. And the United States, if it's asking other countries to raise their ambition, as we go around the world doing, we should also be ready to say, and hey, we're a solutions provider as well. We'll hold your hand, we will walk you through, and we have technologies and services and business models that can work in a place as diverse as, from Bangladesh to Poland to Vietnam and Indonesia and beyond.
All
Thank you,
right.
David. That's a great description. I'm going to let Congressman Blumenauer answer, and then I have a follow-up question for him.
I agree with many of the very positive things that David has referenced. I think the administration has done And in fact, the private sector over the last 10 years has been moving forward with leaps and bounds. The problem is that we have to have a sense of urgency that we don't have. We're going much too slow. We don't have in place, working against ourselves, sadly here. Bill's notion about in the long term, I agree with him about China. I mean, there has been some significant, and it's in their interest. People are dying because of the reliance on coal, and but the fact is they have a different timetable than we have. We can't afford for them to work out, for example, these coal investments that they have over the next 60 years and to catch up. We can't afford for the United States to have these encouraging conversations with other countries. We need, for example, to put teeth into it. I have legislation with Senator Schatz that would make it illegal to be selling products in the United States, commodities that are grown on illegally forested land for palm oil and soy. Have some teeth in the market mechanism, not just the economic advantage. If we had time, that would work. We don't have time. And I think that's why I'm so intrigued with the movement that's taking place with the carbon border adjustment. We can put teeth into it. We can accelerate it. We can make these very positive developments that David's talking about. We can make them real in a much accelerated timetable and make that dynamic work for us on a time frame that will help us save our way of life.
Thank you. I mean, one of the things, David, that you talked about was ensuring that, we put something in place that lasts. And obviously that brings us to the point of legislation, right? We don't want, to see a series of regulations that a next administration could undo. So I know that Congressman Blumenauer, you've said that you think right now there's an opportunity for some bipartisan congressional support for carbon border adjustment mechanisms, driven in part by the desire to constrain imports from China, which are typically more carbon intensive. Can you talk a little bit about what you see in Congress and the political landscape around this issue?
Let me just say that there's another step that needs to take place. I mean, we've got to get to the point where we can actually work with Republicans again, that we're able to have some sort of civil activity. I note that the Republicans in the House want to punish the 13 Republicans that voted for the bipartisan infrastructure bill that's good for America and good for their districts. They want to strip away their committee assignments. So we've got some work to do in the interim, but I do think the antipathy towards China, the notion that there are ways to harness the green advantages that Catrina was talking about, that we have an opportunity interim to start moving in that direction. But I'd start with the European Union. I'd start to see if we can get the administration to move with us and see if we can smoke something out. I'm convinced that this will happen over the course of the next decade, but we don't have time to wait for the next decade.
Well, so I'll just say, obviously, for the US to successfully implement a CBAM, we need to first set a domestic price for carbon. And I'm just going to ask everybody to comment a little bit on the challenges, both the technical challenges, but also the policy and political challenges of doing that.
Well,
Catrina, go ahead, Congressman.
I was just going to say, I'll leave to my colleagues to talk about the technical aspects. I think the key here is what we do with the carbon revenue. And I think they need to be broadly shared with the American public, that a significant portion of it goes back to them so that they see that this isn't just something that's disappears into the ether. I was in the middle of the hopelessly complex cap and trade negotiations, and it was the cap and tax, and it didn't work. I couldn't even get our Ways and Means Committee to support our carbon tax proposals. I've introduced, co-sponsored every one since I've been in Congress. We need to make this adjustment in terms of where the revenues go. The technical things I think can be done, and Catrina can talk to that. And Bill's right, we can do workarounds in terms of how we work with other countries to make it WTO compliant. But I think the key is making sure that these revenues go back to the American public, and we can demonstrate the impact for key industries that they will be better off.
Congressman, what an excellent tee up. So at the Climate Leadership Council, we work on a policy that includes a dividend. So charge a carbon fee, recognize that a carbon fee, that any decarbonization policy we pick is going to have cost implications that will inevitably in some form make their way through to the American taxpayer, to make households whole, to help households weather this transition, and to help out those households who are sort of least able to absorb any cost increases from energy. We propose a dividend. If you use a dividend, refund the money to the American people in the form of a per capita dividend, so everybody gets the same share. What we find is that the average household in the 8 lowest income brackets comes out ahead. That means they take more money in a dividend than they spend out in cost increases associated with the carbon fee for energy services, and other things. So they are better off with a carbon policy than without. That's one way to change how we talk politically. The carbon advantage and the CBAM, that's another really great way to change how we talk about this politically. We've recently done polling to look at maybe like the salience of this idea of charging imports for their emissions as a way to advantage clean US industry. And we received poll numbers back on that I have never seen in my time working on climate policy. A more popular approach, implementing a border adjustment mechanism of some form, is a more popular approach than any of the proposals presently being debated in Congress today. It's much more popular than our package as a whole. People are willing to pay more money for American-made goods if it holds China accountable and it advantages clean domestic industry. That's a transformational approach to the political conversation, because this idea of willingness to pay, we've never gotten positive poll numbers on it. But if it's a leverage point to hold China accountable, then you can get buy-in. And I think this highlights one of the major gaps in how we've talked about carbon pricing so far, which is that we're talking about what the US does alone, and then you sort of hope the rest of the world moves with you. And that's a very unsatisfying answer for the American public. They don't want to be left holding the bag if other countries aren't reducing their emissions too. Introducing this leverage point of a border adjustment does exactly what the Congressman was talking about in creating a new policy that China can't avoid and can't ignore. We can hold them accountable for their emissions. We can combine forces with like-minded other countries to do the same and have a real meaningful impact to bend the curve on carbon emissions overseas. Even before you start thinking about the innovative potential of the US economy, our ability to sell those products overseas to help them further reduce emissions. Yeah, we're approaching a really sort of transformational argument here in carbon policy, which is this notion that once we're developing domestic policy with that international interface in mind, we're really moving the ball forward with the American public.
Well, I'm going to toss in a few more questions, and then I see that we have questions piling up in our Q&A. So I'm going to turn to China, since that is one of the big questions at hand. So if the US, for instance, move forward with a CBAM arrangement with the EU on steel and aluminum, it's obviously going to disadvantage the Chinese. And we just have achieved a little bit of a breakthrough with them, on this deal to lower methane emissions. How do we continue working with China, if we, while implementing a CBAM that's obviously going to disadvantage them and cause friction? Just toss out that question. I'm going to ask Bill for his thoughts about that, and obviously everyone else can chime in.
Well, I was going to comment on the previous question.
Go ahead.
If that's all right. I was heartened by what Catrina said. I've been surprised that the administration, I'm sorry, we've lost David, but I'm surprised the administration hasn't been more forthcoming on the carbon pricing issue. It begins there, as Arit said, and they have so far seemed to be reluctant to head down that road. I assume that's a political decision, and the polling that Catrina cited may change their mind. Although I also have to say that, you know, there's as with other things in this area, Europe is ahead of us, and we can see whether public opinion there is going to evolve as well. Public opinion there has been positive about everything she's talking about, but they are now reaching the point where they're going to be confronted with the actual price increases that are going to occur as a result of these policies. It'll be interesting to see if public opinion shifts in Europe when this actually becomes a more realistic possibility as opposed to a theoretical one. As for China, I mean, the steel and aluminum issue is broader than, it's not simply a climate issue. In fact, looking at it from a trade perspective, I think the administrations, and they're not the first. I mean, they're probably the fifth at least the fifth administration in a row trying to do something that to protect the steel industry in particular from unfair trade practices. I used to, when I was on the Hill, I spent 17 years effectively as the director of the Senate Steel Caucus. So I have a long history with this industry, and they have a very good record of demonstrating that they've been the victim of unfair trade practices. And a lot of what various administrations, including this one, have done is to try to offset that. This is a problem of global overcapacity. And there's really one major culprit, and that's China, which now accounts for more than half of the total capacity in the world for steel, and has accomplished that in a relatively short period of time. And I think what the administration is trying to do, and the Europeans are also trying to do, is basically push that surplus back into China and make them eat it. Because the alternative is to do what they're doing, which is to push it off on everybody else and imperil everybody else's industry in the process. The fact that it's less green steel, if you will, or dirtier steel coming out of China is a convenient excuse that we can use to put a climate gloss on a larger policy problem. But I have to say, I think I agree with you. It's not going to make the Chinese happy, but if you're going to address the capacity problem, which is endemic with non-market economies, I mean, see it with steel and aluminum. Semiconductors is next. 5 or 10 years from now, it'll be mainframe commercial aircraft. When credit is allocated by the state rather than the market, you get overinvestment and you get overcapacity inevitably. And the Chinese policy has been to export the overcapacity. I think countries need to get together to combat that. If you can do it with a climate justification, that makes it look better. But the underlying policy is to deal with the capacity problem.
I mean, I've also read that, various things that China is setting up a couple clean steel factories and will export to the US from those factories and sending the rest of its capacity to Asia, which is, minus Japan, which is further behind on, the CBAM and happier to absorb, the dirtier steel, so globally that doesn't really change things.
No, you're right, though. I mean, there people have said the same thing about what they're going to do with Xinjiang cotton, export it to countries that don't have forced labor restrictions and find, other places, other ways to deal with countries that do. I mean, that demonstrates the shortcoming of basically sanctions-based trade policy. In a globally interconnected world, there's always another path. There's always workarounds. And, you know, in a way, it's a losing battle to try to constantly plug those things, but that's the effort that we're engaged in. The secret, or the solution, not the secret, which I think this administration understands, is a multilateral approach. If you get all the victims together taking the same action in a concerted effort, you have a greater chance of success than a piecemeal approach. Trump never understood that. I think Biden does.
I totally agree with what Bill's saying, but I think there are things that we can do. We want to bring people together in a multilateral basis. And conversations with the European Union on a carbon border adjustment is a way to go forward. But for example, the United States ought to right now deny access for the Chinese in terms of procurement unless and until they become WTO compliant. This notion after 20 years, they're a developing country and they can still compete on business here and we can't there. I would cut it off. We just finished several hearings on our trade subcommittee dealing with how the Chinese have exploited the de minimis loophole. Well, there are ways that we can fix that. Have responsibility for the supply chain. And there are several mechanisms we're looking at to plug that loophole that is 2 million to 3 million packages a day that circumvents our tariffs and enables them to have an unfair competitive advantage. We don't have to sit back and do that. Being able to use the leverage that we've got, use the American economy, and being able to work with other countries at the same time, I think we can offset that. I like the phrase Bill had, make them eat it. Don't let them infiltrate the United States market. I mentioned some mechanisms in terms of commodities from illegally forested land. It's not easy, but it can be done. That's a mechanism we use to crack down on illegal logging, products from illegal logging over the last 10 years that's made a difference. I think we need to move forward with specific things, and that's something that I think the Chinese understand, but whether they understand it or not, we can restrict their access to our market for perfectly legitimate, sound reasons, and we can make that stick.
I just, if I can comment on
ahead.
that, I just say, yeah, you can do that. And I think it's important to do that, but it's not the most important thing. I think what the administration has done is realized, the metaphor I use, if you're in a marathon, and there's only two ways to win. You run faster than the other guy, or you trip the other guy. You're talking about tripping the other guy, and that's appropriate, particularly when they're cheating. But the more important part of the equation is running faster. The issue for Americans, ultimately, for American companies, is going to be their ability to compete with China elsewhere. The Chinese are not going to treat us fairly in China, and we can get even by not treating them fairly in the United States. That's fine. The issue is who's going to win in India, who's going to win in Latin America, who's going to win in Africa, who's going to win in Europe, who's going to win in the rest of Asia. There, the administration is getting it right. I think they're talking about build back better. They're talking about running faster. I think that's the more important goal.
I agree with most of what you just said, but I'm not talking about tripping them. I'm talking about not letting them trip us. There's a difference. And I do think that these are elements here that we can employ while we work with other countries, while we deal with some of our inherent advantages, mobilize our economic advantages, technology, the market access, and the fact that we have more in common with the countries that Catrina was talking about.
Well, I'm going to turn to a couple of the questions from our audience. So in terms of broadening out beyond the EU, Sarah Stewart asks whether there have been conversations around negotiating regional carbon pricing between the US, Mexico, and Canada, given that Canada introduced the idea of an international carbon floor at COP26, and that starting regionally could be a lot easier than multilaterally. Wonder if anybody has thoughts on that, and Congressman, whether that's something that you or others in Congress have thought about.
We're still in the process of implementing our NAFTA 2.0. I think there is a great benefit to thinking regionally, and I hope it's on the administration's agenda and Ambassador Tai, but I'm not aware of discussions relative to carbon, but I assume they are there, and I would encourage them.
I just say, until the administration is prepared to go down that road domestically and talk about carbon pricing here, I don't see how they're going to be ready to talk about dealing with it in any collective framework. We have to turn the corner here, and for reasons I don't fully understand, maybe Catrina can explain, they don't seem to be there yet.
Well, I don't think I can explain that, but I think I can talk about a different dimension here. So we're operating under the assumption that you need a domestic carbon price to build a border adjustment mechanism. That's something that we believe at the council, the easiest way to build an effective border adjustment mechanism is to base it around a domestic price. The CBAM proposal is working towards doing that with the Europeans emissions trading scheme. It looks like the Canadians are trying to approximate that with their own carbon policy. It is not the only way to build a border adjustment mechanism. As we saw in the EU-US steel and aluminum deal, you can also agree to form a joint agreement on what your goals are in uniting climate and trade. As we've seen in the European Union, as they're evolving their CBAM mechanism, you can also look to the comparable effectiveness of the suite of policies designed to reduce carbon emissions. So I will flag that the council firmly believes that a carbon price is the single best way to decarbonize the US economy and build a border adjustment mechanism. But people are getting creative about what the future will look like of these climate and trade deals. And the Biden administration is operating within the confines of the policy that we have today, which does not include a carbon price.
Thank you. That actually answers one of the questions we got in our Q&A, where someone mentioned that the NEC director, Brian Deese, mentioned that US goods can avoid a CBAM tariff without a national price for carbon. So thank you for asking that.
I want to just make one comment. The Biden administration is absolutely committed to their pledge that nobody who makes under $400,000 is going to have a tax increase. And that's posed all sorts of complications we've had with some of the tax reforms in the reconciliation package. And I think until we're able to deal with that mandate that the administration has put down, they're not, if it looks at all like a tax for people under $400,000, they won't support it.
Thank you. So we have a question actually from our friend Fred Hochberg, who says, good news about the US steel industry. The question is, isn't much of the steel produced in the US from scrap versus mined ore? And how much of that is a factor in the low carbon impact of US steel?
It's a really great question. One of the I guess problems with working to define this carbon advantage first without people going before us is that we have to make some assumptions to simplify our comparisons. One of the simplifications we made in looking at the steel industry impacts of a border adjustment mechanism was to look only at emissions associated with individual facilities and with the electricity that they purchase. So we were not looking at the carbon footprint of the material, the source material that they use, though we do know that if you're using recycled material, you can skip that oxidization step, which removes a whole lot of the emissions from the profile. But yes, recycling the source material for steel absolutely confers a carbon advantage through the supply chain. That is one of the major points of advantage that the United States steel industry brings to the table. They're identifying ways to manufacture steel from recycled source material, but with the same quality components that virgin steel provides. So it's an innovation that they're bringing to the table. It's one of the points that gives us that steel advantage, carbon advantage in steel that we documented in our case study.
Of course, that depends too. I mean, I agree with that, but it also depends on how far back in the production process you want to count. Because if you get into the scrap, the industry, the electric furnace part of the industry that makes steel by melting scrap, then you also need to look at where the electricity is coming from. And if it's coal-fired electricity, then it's less green than if it were hydropower or if it were some alternative source. Now, it's the farther back you go, the more difficult it is to count, which is more or less what you said, and you have to stop someplace. But it's not all that simple to figure all this out, I guess, which is one reason why I go back to what I said in the beginning. The whole thing would benefit from an international agreement on how to count these things so that everybody was doing it the same way.
One more question on steel is that, one of the concerns comes from downstream industries who are concerned about, about CBAMs is concern about increased prices for components that are subject to a carbon adjustment. And what are the best ways to shape a global, a CBAM mechanism to ensure that downstream industries are not disadvantaged? Should we lever a carbon adjustment for downstream products? How do we work that?
I'll talk about what our perspective is as we're developing a CBAM with our partners in industry at the environmental NGOs. The conversation about carbon border adjustments is moving from sort of the academic literature to potential policy. And that transition is letting us ask really interesting questions. This is precisely one of them. If you are imposing a border adjustment on a limited basket of goods, aren't you creating a cost burden for industries that use those goods and an incentive to move those industries overseas to avoid the border adjustment? So if you charge imported steel, imported glass a border adjustment, but not an imported car, why not make the car overseas instead? We're exploring with our partners, what does it look like to build a border adjustment that works well with supply chains as they actually exist, and is specifically designed to account for the way we engage in trade, because we know that there can be forms of leakage outside of these energy intensive industries, especially for industries that have tight profit margins, for industries that engage in long-term contracting. We need to be really aware of what the implications of a border adjustment will be for those industries as well. This is not just about capturing sort of the most imported carbon. This is about addressing how the United States engages in trade today.
It does create a policy dilemma of how gradual do you want to be in this? I mean, I think the initial CBAM proposals have been limited, as Catrina said, to a select number of industries. And I think part of that is just because people want to ease into this, partly because they're not sure how it's going to work, and they're not sure if it's going to work, and they're concerned about the politics of it. It does then create exactly the problem the questioner raised, which is if you only include some, then you're not affecting other parties, and there's a cascade effect here. You have the alternative, of course, is to do everything at once, which is a much higher risk alternative, because then if you made a mistake, the consequences are both political and economic are far greater.
Yeah. So we have some more questions, so we're going to move through things. Less developed countries have actually, I think rightfully argued that they need more time to adjust to tighter emissions standards. And how can we evolve a CBAM scheme, where less developed countries won't be severely disadvantaged? Do we compensate them? What are our options around that? Anybody want to take a crack on that, Congressman Blumenauer?
Well, I think we need to honor initial commitments we have made to developing countries to deal with the climate crisis. We have fallen woefully short on the initial pledges that were made early in this process. We need to follow through on that. I mean, we're talking about several $100 billion. And I would think that we ought to be able to help them as part of when the money finally does flow. And I think it will over the course of this decade. I think there will be greater willingness to own up to our responsibilities to the harm that has happened to a number of these countries. And it's in all of our advantage to be able to help developing countries avoid some of the mistakes of a carbon intense development pattern, although it's certainly what the United States did for 200 years and what path China's following now and will follow for the next half century. So I would hope that these resources that we have committed but have not followed through on, that this would be part of our package of helping them.
I hope you're right. I mean, obviously, historically, the US has not been too generous with our support for developing countries. I'm going to shift. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Catrina.
I just want to pick up on this last concept that the Congressman mentioned, which is like the package of policies. So a CBAM, when I talk about a carbon tax, I talk about how there's no silver bullet. A carbon fee like we're proposing at the council is not enough to reduce our emissions at the scale and speed demanded by the climate challenge, but we will not reduce our emissions enough without a carbon fee. Similarly, we are not going to be able to reconcile appropriately our climate and trade interests without a border carbon adjustment, but it's probably not going to be enough. So we need to think about the suite of packages that sit around the border adjustment as we think about challenges for least developed countries, for our middle income trading partners. But we also need to recognize that if we're applying a border adjustment and offering sort of blanket exceptions for these countries, it is very likely that state-owned enterprises will just shift their manufacture to these countries to avoid any border adjustment.
Right.
That's why we have to think about this as a package. How can we ensure that the border adjustment serves the purpose it's designed to, which is to hold emitters accountable appropriately for their emissions, while we're using an opportunity to elevate least developed countries and give them the tools they need to decarbonize and enrich their economies.
Thank you. We now have a whole a series of questions on WTO compatibility. I'm just going to say, and Bill, I was very happy that you felt it was completely compatible, and I've read Jennifer's work, which is also encouraging. You know, in April, Ambassador Tai said the WTO is considered by many as an institution that not only has no solutions to offer on environmental concerns, but is part of the problem. So that's another perspective. So I guess a couple questions are that have come in the chat. How would you need to craft a CBAM to make it WTO compliant? And then John Magnus asks, should we be explicitly applying, at least for the time being, a WTO consistent filter to every proposal Congress considers on decarbonization? Other options are just to move forward and, feeling like the WTO needs to adjust to the new reality. So
Well,
get everybody's thoughts on it.
John has a great gift of asking hard questions. Let me tackle, well, both of them. You can get into the weeds on WTO compatibility. Let me just say, I think the largest issue where various proposals fail is on the national treatment standard, which is essentially the rule that you have to treat the foreigners the same way you treat the domestics. And that's a fundamental WTO rule that sort of transcends all the weeds. And it's where these policies tend to fail, because the difficulty, and well, largely because when this gets litigated, the panels that look at these things, they look at not at the intent as much as they do at the effect. And if you end up doing something that inadvertently or not gives the domestic parties an advantage over the foreigners, then you have a problem. What that means in CBAM terms is if you're going to have a border adjustment measure, you have to have an equivalent carbon tax on domestic production of the like product. And that brings with it, a host of political questions about whether you can do that. But I mean, as a practical matter, if you can design your program in such a way so that, if you're taxing carbon the same way, not the same way, to the same extent domestically as you are internationally, then you've fundamentally met the most important WTO standard. I mean, there's various exemptions you can try to apply to get around some of these things. But basically, if you're not meeting the national treatment test, you're going to fail. On John's question of whether we should be asking that all the time. I mean, I'm a trade wonk, so my answer would be yes, because the United States has spent 70 years invested in building this system, that we have over time been one of its major beneficiaries, and we lose a lot if we don't maintain that investment. I mean, this was not the Trump administration's view, and it does not appear to be the Biden administration's view either. And I mean, that's a much larger debate. I mean, I think Catherine's wrong in the quote that you gave, and it may well, the Biden administration is demonstrating right now. If you look at the EV tax credit, for example, which is going to run afoul of WTO rules, and if you look at some of their domestic procurement policies as well, these things are all going to be violate the WTO rules, and nobody seems to care right now. And I'll just say, I care, and that probably doesn't make any difference. John, I hope you care too, but I don't have high hopes that this administration is going to make that an operating principle.
Can I add that I think that the best version of a BCA, a border adjustment mechanism of some sort, the one that will be most effective to address climate emissions, to support the competitiveness position of clean US industries, I think the best version of that proposal will be consistent with the spirit of WTO. However, I don't think it's wise to apply this test, is this proposal consistent with the WTO upfront? Because we are taking this concept from the literature, where it's really easy to design a proposal on paper that's consistent with the WTO, to real life. And it's hard to do this. It's hard to navigate the trade-offs associated with such a consequential policy. And what we need right now is really creative thinking. I've heard a lot of excellent ideas from Congressman Blumenauer today, and he and his colleagues are actively trying to figure out how you can accomplish these goals. And until we see a lot of creative thinking through the legislative drafting process and debate, we can't take any ideas off the table. I think it's really wise to let that creativity play out in the forum where it will be of greatest consequence, which is in the US Congress, before we start applying these limits about what is and is not consistent with the WTO. And then I'll finally add that we've been talking about border adjustment mechanisms since negotiating the Kyoto Agreement. And the whole time, the WTO has said, we're not the right forum to address climate emissions. You go talk to the UNFCCC, and the UNFCCC has said, we're not the right forum to navigate these trade-offs. You go talk to the WTO. And they have even written joint reports that say the same thing, which means we need to bust through this limit in the international bodies and figure out how to reconcile the two, which again comes back to this idea that we just need a whole lot of creativity from our members of Congress, think tanks, whoever is here to help us address this challenge.
Congressman, your thoughts?
I agree with them.
Terrific. So couple questions in the chat, and then we're gonna wrap up. There was a question about how should our allies trust us on this, given that another administration might come in and undo any agreements that are being negotiated. And obviously one answer is legislation, which I know, Congressman, you're pushing hard for, but any other thoughts on that? I mean, I think that is a challenge for the US generally in terms of moving forward at this point, given what what we saw happen under the last administration.
I think the work that Ambassador Tai and other members of the administration are doing to try and reconstruct a relationships. Bill mentioned the United States is the primary architect of a global trading scheme for the last 75 years. We need to demonstrate that we are heavily invested in it. We're committed to working with our allies. I think, and not necessarily our allies, but other countries that share our interests. There's tremendous power in doing that. And I think by putting these pieces back together, demonstrating good faith, making specific progress. We've had a little bit of a breakthrough on the Airbus Boeing wars. We're starting to dial down some of the tariff activities. I mentioned specific areas of legislation that I think we can advance in some cases that would actually have some bipartisan agreement. I think we can do that. For example, closing the de minimis loopholes and the abuses that are taking place. I think we demonstrate by doing. There's tremendous power with the part of the global economy that shares our values, shares our interests, and that we frankly have treated pretty shabbily over the course of the last 4 years. Being able to reconstruct those relationships, and at the same time, I've had a steady stream of people come through my office from the private sector who are concerned about the consequences that have taken place. I think there are some hard lessons that are being learned, and I think some folks in the private sector were willing to be quiet with some of the outrages of the Trump administration because they thought they were getting something like with the tax bill or that they stood to lose things. But I think they understand the costs and consequences that are taking place, and that being able to harness the competitive advantage we have, not just in terms of clean technology, but we fighting more aggressively to protect our intellectual property, what gives people access to American markets in a way that is not protectionist, but is being consistent with our values and protections of the environment and worker rights and against forced labor. And I think there's a larger contingency of people that are supporting that, and there's strength in numbers. And I think we've got 38 months of the Biden administration where I think progress can be made, and it'll be harder to reverse with somebody else coming in.
Oh, that's a great message. So, Bill.
I get this all the time, particularly when I talk to Europeans. I think when historians write this era, Congressman Blumenauer is right. One of the lasting horrible legacies of the last administration is that it basically cast lasting doubt on America's consistency and reliability as an ally. We've had, we've alternated parties in power for many years, and they've all operated within a relatively narrow range on a lot of these issues. So you could count on the United States to be consistent. And after 4 years of Trump, people are telling me over and over again, we can't do that anymore. And, I don't have much of an answer to that. I think what Mr. Blumenauer was saying is right. My answer back to them has been simply to say, look, we're a democracy. We have elections. So are you. There's a French election coming up. They're right-wing candidates. Are they going to win? There was a German election coming that came and went, and they've changed parties. Is that going to produce dramatically different policies? We'll see. Democracies have elections, things change. We can't do anything about that. We just have to do the best we can in the interim. And I think the assumption that Ori started with, which is the best way to do that is through legislation that at least makes it difficult to undo, is the best approach.
Well, Bill, one other thing, I feel that a number of us have fallen down in terms of spotlighting the cost of these incoherent, inconsistent, destructive policies. I mean, the nonsense that somehow the Chinese will pay the tariffs. The tariffs extracted a cost on the American consumer and business. The notion that we are going to make up the damage to the agricultural sector by throwing subsidy money at it. I think that there's a growing awareness that there have been significant costs of this disruption, this incoherence, and making confusing our allies and friends, if not alienating them. And I think having a concerted effort that is in government, with the private sector, and you certified smart people in the think tank world to be able to document what the costs and consequences were. And if we do a better job of that, because we are a democracy, it's going to be harder to undo. And I do think that this should be an issue in the next presidential election, starting now.
I agree.
Right. Me too. There's one last question that I'll just kind of toss out, but I think we need to wrap up. We're at that witching hour. And that is there still room for tax credits for solar, wind, and other types of renewable energy? Congressman?
Yes.
All right. On that note, I just really wanted to thank everybody for what I thought was a great panel. I certainly learned quite a bit. And if people listening have additional questions that they have, feel free to reach out to Bill Reinsch, Catrina, myself, and we'll try to get your questions answered. We look forward to having you join both ALI and CSIS in future programs. Stay well, be safe. Thank you. Thank you, Congressman. Bye-bye.
Thanks, yeah.